Hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf, and I'm just thrilled to be here at the American Institute for Economic Research with Jenin Younes. So happy to be talking to you, Jenin.
It's nice to talk to you too.
Fantastic. So Jenin Younes is a really accomplished person in a lot of ways. She's a criminal defense attorney in New York City, which is pretty courageous. She fights for people who've been accused of crimes and making sure everyone gets due process of law. But she's also gone on a bit of a journey as a commentator and researcher and spokesperson. And I'll let you tell us about it, but she's moved, she comes from the left, let's put it that way. And I especially wanted to talk to her today because she did an amazing piece, which is featured on the AIER website. You've got to take a look at it. And we're publishing it on Daily Cloud as well, which I'm thrilled about. And it's called Faces of Lockdown. And she and some colleagues interviewed several people to, get past the rhetoric around what lockdown is doing to people and hear from men and women on the street, speaking from the center of their lives themselves. So Jenin, let's start with your journey to this place. We're in a beautiful research institute in Great Barrington in the Hudson River Valley, or actually in the Berkshires. We're surrounded by free market enthusiasts, and you come from the left, as do I. What was that journey like?
So I sort of very early on doubted the lockdown policy. I just thought, you can't really stop the world in its tracks. It's a very interconnected, complicated world. And what's going to happen if we just remove humanitarian, people who are providing humanitarian aid in developing countries? Kids who live in abusive households, all of a sudden they can't go to school. Probably the only place they have to escape those homes. Kids who just come from poor families and whose families can't afford laptops for them to learn. Mm-hmm. It just struck me as wrong. And so I was just frustrated for a long time. I started doing a lot of research. All of the media around me was very pro-lockdown. I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, et cetera. And none of these media outlets doubted the narrative at all, the lockdown narrative. So I started going outside of that. I came across people like Jeffrey Tucker, who's the editorial director here, Alex Berenson, who is a former New York Times reporter and a novelist who doubted the lockdown narrative as well. So I just began reading and doing more research, and I looked at Sweden, which didn't shut down in the same way at all. They sort of relied mostly on voluntary restrictions and was doing quite well, yet their circumstances were sort of twisted by the media and portrayed as a failure when there was no real evidence for that. So the more I looked, the more I just saw there was, this was just not the way to go. And at some point I was so frustrated, I just wrote a piece called, Why the Left Should Abhor Lockdowns or something like that. And it was about all of the detrimental effects that lockdowns are having on especially the poor and working class. And just on a whim, I knew of Jeffrey Tucker. I sent it to him. I thought, well, I'll see what happens. And he published it. And then he invited me to come here. And I just started writing for them more and spending some time here and getting to know people here and more people from different backgrounds.
And for people who are not familiar with AIER, they are one of the few institutions, organizations that, as I understand from the start, have been very vocal about in criticism of lockdowns as being opposed to the Constitution, basic human rights. How do you feel about lockdowns as a lawyer? I mean, you have this fascinating background, to my mind, in terms of this issue of lockdowns, because to me, as a non-lawyer, they seem completely illegal. What's your view about that?
Yeah, I've been very puzzled about why there aren't more lawsuits. It seems to me that there are so many constitutional deprivations going on here. I mean, at the
Can you explain to the layperson what that means,
yes.
a constitutional deprivation?
Yes. So the Constitution gives people the right to assemble for religious purposes, but also for non-religious purposes. And that was completely taken away from us through lockdowns. And I could see a sort of, in a real justification or emergency for a short time, a week or 2 weeks, saying, okay, we can't have people assemble. But for this to go on for months and months and months, and now we're looking at a year, and some countries are saying, the UK, Australia, they're looking at, possibly 2 years of lockdowns. For this to go on for so long is, in my opinion, a basic deprivation of constitutional rights.
And what's the remedy for that typically? A lawsuit or a criminal? proceedings?
Lawsuits. And there have been some. Cuomo was sued and he prevailed in the plaintiffs prevailed in the Supreme Court, but there haven't been enough. And I think there would also be a strong argument to be made that having your business shut down by the government for such an extended period of time, particularly without evidence that it's accomplishing what we want it to accomplish, is another due process deprivation.
Isn't it also, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I was just on the phone with an event space owner in Massachusetts, and I've also spoken to a restaurateur in Massachusetts, Paul D'Amore, and their businesses have basically been seized by the government without any compensation or due process. Isn't that a harm in civil law if someone takes your stuff without any compensation?
Absolutely.
What's that called? Not to put you on the spot.
I don't know if I know a term, but it is a due process violation.
It's theft, right? Or fraud or some sort of financial chicanery to take your stuff without any due process, correct?
Right. And I think, the evidence is also pouring in that restaurants, for instance, which are suffering the most, aren't actually linked to coronavirus spread. Right. So for the government to take that kind of action without any evidence that's even accomplishing what it's supposed to accomplish it's
extraordinary. And again, I just want to back you up on this. I asked Paul D'Amore and this event planner if the officials in Massachusetts who shut them down had given them any science to confirm the statement that they were super spreader sites, and they didn't. And I've been reading the peer-reviewed science, as I'm sure you have, and it really doesn't support some of these policies that we're seeing. I mean, the evidence is very thin. So I would have thought that as a matter of law, if you're going to shut down a whole sector of the economy, you need to be able to provide backup information. Like, what happens if people sue and there is no evidence that these places were harmful to the public health?
Right. Well, I actually spoke to one restaurant owner, and her restaurant is in Little Neck, Queens, and it borders on Nassau County. So her restaurant can't be open for indoor dining because that's in New York City technically, but the restaurants across the street in Nassau County can be open. So she's been trying to bring lawsuits against the state since August, but every time the rules change, she has to amend the lawsuit, and that takes time. So she just can't actually get into court. So the system is almost set up for her to fail.
That's exactly what I'm seeing in other states as well. I think it's very, very cynical. But also as a matter of law, if I can't leave my house, right? In Britain, I just spoke to a member of parliament today, and people are literally, it is against the law for people to leave their homes except for an hour to exercise. I mean, things are beyond anything we can imagine in America. In the Philippines, a colleague of mine, people are allowed out every other day with a ticket, and they have to get a letter from the government to go on a hike. So back to the United States and the law that you're trained in, isn't it some sort of kidnapping or constraint of aren't people being essentially held hostage? What crime is it that people's mobility is being restricted?
I mean, I think you're completely right about it. I thought that from the very beginning, some sort of false imprisonment.
Right.
But I'm shocked. I don't know why my colleagues don't see it the same way. I don't know where the lawsuits are. I don't know. I can't explain it.
It is bizarre to me as well. And let's talk about another constitutional right, if we may, the Fourth Amendment. I mean, the fact that in New York State, the governor said you can't have more than X number of people in your home, and we're going to send sheriffs to check that you aren't assembling with more than 6 people in your home. I mean, doesn't the Fourth Amendment give me the right to be free of unreasonable search and seizure in my private home?
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
so how is that not unconstitutional?
It is. It's all unconstitutional, in my opinion. And
have you looked into emergency law at all? I mean, I know that one state has passed a law to make it impossible for emergency measures to be used in this way. Again, I believe Switzerland is also engaging in a referendum to make sure that emergency measures can't be used again. Are any constitutional lawyers kind of looking at what are the limits of emergency law? I mean, I can tell you as a student of history and as the author of The End of America, which unfortunately predicted a lot of this, or certainly predicted January 6th, that, never in history have emergency powers been given to anyone and then they give them back without a fight or overreaching. So what's the view of lawyers about that?
Well, again, I think that was a huge problem from the start. Cuomo's had emergency powers now. I pay the most attention since I live in New York State. has had emergency powers since March for 10 months. Over the summer, there was no emergency. There was no coronavirus. Now they're really, I don't think there's an emergency. The hospitals aren't overwhelmed. Everything is.
But also let's look at county by county. I live in Columbia County, New York, just over the border. We have fewer coronavirus deaths than opiate overdose deaths.
Yeah.
It's not even in the top 10 causes of deaths. Yeah. But I get an email saying my governor has extended the emergency orders, which include Columbia County. Yeah. So under what law can you extend emergency powers when there's no demonstrable emergency in that county?
I mean, it shouldn't be happening. And I don't know why the legislature also isn't taking a stand on this. I mean, at this point, it's up to them. Cuomo, right. None of these governors are going to give up their emergency powers voluntarily. So they need to be checked by the legislature, but it's just not happening. And I don't know why.
Can they be arrested? I mean, I'm sorry to be, I don't mean to be radical, but isn't this some sort of like massive crime against the people of New York?
I mean, I would love to see all of these people tried for human rights violations under international law.
Well, let's talk about international law. I mean, you know, I know that I'm making you laugh with this suggestion. I don't mean to sound radical at all, but I mean, if it was like February of 2020, and I was saying to you, the governor of New York is going to hold everyone in New York, 18 million people hostage in their homes and crush entire sectors of business and extend emergency powers by fiat. You know, you would tell me either that won't happen, this is America, or, well, he needs to be arrested. You know, this is a criminal act. Right. So this is happening.
Yeah.
I guess what I want to ask you about is international law, because this is a violation of Geneva Conventions. It's a violation of so many, you know, basic human rights principles. Suspending education, right? Don't children have a basic human right to an education? Isn't it against some charter of human rights to withhold education from children?
Yeah, I think so. And it also is against sort of basic principles of human rights law to deprive people of their ability to earn a living and to support themselves and their families. I think it's possible in the future that people could be tried in international tribunals. I mean, anything can happen with that, but that usually has to happen down the road once society has changed. Right now, everybody accepts this. I don't know why.
Right. And when you talk to other lawyers, what reasons do they give for being so on board with these violations of human rights, basic human rights principles and law?
So most of my friends and colleagues just see it completely differently. They are convinced that bodies are falling in the streets, that this is, equivalent to the Black Plague or something like that. And that, we have to do whatever we can. And I really fault the media. I endlessly in my articles, I fault the New York Times. Their reporting is extremely dishonest. They twist the facts, and most Democrats, most liberals really trust the New York Times, and it's beyond their comprehension that the Times is really lying to them. And, a lot of articles have these headlines like, actually 300,000 deaths are attributed to the coronavirus, not 200. But when you read the article, it's clear that the other 100,000 it's excess deaths that are caused, deaths of despair, opioid overdoses, suicides, et cetera, are rising.
So they're attributable to the policies around the
Right. And people read the headline and they, I get people are busy. They have kids. Now they're working from home with the kids, and they don't have time to do it, to really look at the article carefully. But when you read carefully, that's what you realize.
No, it's shocking. I've found the same thing. For instance, the coronavirus map that they keep reproducing is based on PCR tests, which have been debunked. That's a whole other subject that we can address when we come back, with a glass of wine some night and have a lot of time, because it's a rabbit hole. But quite apart from that, it's not a medical dashboard. It's the COVID-19 tracking project, which is sponsored by The Atlantic, which was bought by Bloomberg, which is produces data streams that aren't even by doctors or health departments, but by unnamed volunteers, and also something called Enigma Business Solutions, which is a hedge fund information site. So it's not, verifiable data. It doesn't provide data sets. It doesn't provide sources or methodologies. Everything is wrong with it. And I say that as someone who builds digital dashboards in my other job. It's shocking misrepresentation for sure. And I agree with you that people we know and love, our tribe is very much hostage to what the New York Times says, or NPR, and they're all singing from the same quite misleading playbook. So now let's go to Faces of Lockdown. Tell me why you decided to go into the street with colleagues and really find people who have been affected by lockdown and support them in telling their stories.
Well, I realized there was just not very much of that. And as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words, or a video is worth even more than that, maybe. And I think people really don't get it, especially, which I'm one, white collar professionals who have relatively comfortable situation. Most of us haven't seen cuts to our paycheck. We have reasonable accommodations. So I think a lot of people just really don't get it. And I wanted to show.
You mean a lot of upper middle class people don't get it?
Yeah. They just don't, something isn't clicking about what other people are going through. And I thought that perhaps if I found people who could show how this has really ruined their lives and is ruining their lives and the lives of their families as well, that might help to persuade people. So
who did you find?
We interviewed about 10 people, mostly restaurant owners. We had some scheduled interviews, and then we walked around randomly on the street and talked to some people. So we talked to a couple of people we found because they were suing the city. So so a woman who owns a restaurant called Kellogg's Diner in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, that she's on the verge now of going out of business. Her husband had actually died a couple of years ago, and she had never worked in the restaurant industry, but learned how to run the business to support their she has four children.
Heartbreaking.
And she's about to lose the diner now. And she was, just sobbing the entire interview. And she keeps saying, we did everything asked of them. They revamped for indoor dining to meet the standards required by the state. And then they just said, you can't do it. So the restaurant was completely empty. And she said, this is a 24-hour diner that's usually packed. It was like a Sunday morning or something. There's nobody in there, a couple people getting takeout.
And they showed her no science to support.
No. And we talked to an immigrant from Turkey who owned a Turkish restaurant, who started crying in the middle and said he couldn't feed his children anymore. A woman who had immigrated from Greece, who again, she was also going to lose her business and was very upset throughout the interview. So
what was her business?
She also owned a restaurant. Yeah, it was. And then
where was that?
That was near Little Neck. Yeah, it was in Little Neck, Queens. Yeah, and we spoke to a barber who, same thing. He was actually doing okay because right now they're allowed to do haircuts, but he said if there was another lockdown, it would drive him out of business.
Well, that's, something that people who are not small business owners can't possibly imagine, with this uncertainty of can you open, can you not open, under what circumstances. People can't plan ahead. They can't order supplies, especially in the restaurant industry. Food goes bad, or there's not enough food, or you lay people off, you can't get them back. It's this switch going off and on in what should be a capitalist economy that is taking agency away from small business owners and crushing them. So what did you conclude, or what's your biggest takeaway for you personally after having talked to the Faces of Lockdown?
To be honest, it was what I expected. That people's lives are really being destroyed by this, and for no good reason. There's no reason that these businesses can't be open. It's not saving lives, and it's destroying people, the city, and their families. We also actually, I forgot to mention, we spoke to a special ed teacher at a school in Brooklyn who his school is now shut down again, and he was describing what his students are going through. It's a lot of students are from immigrant families who parents don't speak English, can't really help with the homework. And he said they're just falling behind. Looking at a screen all day is not going to school. And another thing he mentioned was, especially when you teach, because he teaches a lot of kids with disabilities, he relies on being in the classroom in order to sort of get a look at who's engaging, who's not, and he can't do that at all. So he doesn't know what's going on with them. Some of them have just completely given up, and he doesn't hear from them at all.
I heard that. So what's really heartbreaking is that you're an eyewitness to a group of restaurant owners and a barber, and I literally have heard the same stories from another group of restaurant owners and the doctor of another barber in Ontario, saying this barber is an immigrant. He has 3 kids to feed. His family is eating Mr. Noodle, which I guess is a Canadian cheap noodle food. Like they have no food, and this is in Canada. And literally the regulations changing and people saying, I've done everything, and then it doesn't matter. You still have to close with no reason, no rationale. I am very cynical about why restaurants are being targeted from reporting I've done. And again, not to go down another rabbit hole, but when I went to New York recently, to Manhattan, I saw half of Chinatown is closed. All those small businesses, the restaurants closed, Tribeca, Soho, closed restaurants, but a vast amount of construction going on for luxury apartments. So I'm cynical enough, and having been a political consultant, there's no such thing as being too cynical. I'm cynical enough to see a real estate play in what's happening, because with some of these policies, you can literally bet on when people are going to give up and sell a distressed asset at a fire sale. And so what I see is industrial investors, the big developers, the big restaurateurs, the chain restaurants are going to come in, scoop up those properties, pennies on the dollar, and drive out their competition. It's just that simple.
Irene Siderakis, the owner of the Kellogg's Diner in Williamsburg that I mentioned, said the same thing. That's what she thinks is happening. And I mean, frankly, the rationale behind all of this is so bad. I tend to think there could be some, I try to shy away from conspiracy theories, but I think there could be some truth to it. And I mean, the stats were showing 1.4% of coronavirus cases are traced to restaurants, whereas 74% are traced to household gatherings.
Right.
Well, people aren't going to not socialize for a year. So what are they going to do? They're going to go to people's houses. That's what I do. I'll admit it. Instead of going out to a restaurant. So you're actually probably driving up cases by...
Well, that's interesting. Also, I want to note that even that 1.4% is from Governor Cuomo's statement. I haven't seen it in a peer-reviewed study. I want to share with all you restaurant owners out there that I've been, reading the literature. A loved one is a chef, and, I care about what happens to restaurateurs. And there's one peer-reviewed study that everyone cites. It's from a small, crowded, air-conditioned, closed restaurant, closed doors, windows, sealed restaurant in Hong Kong. That science was produced under the oversight of the Chinese Communist Party. Scientists under Chinese dominion are not free to reach any conclusion they want. So I would really take that with a grain of salt. But everyone, including the New York Times, cites that study. Has it been reproduced? That other studies I've seen that show like barbecues are a super spreader event. If you really read the study, what it shows is a large group of people, all of whom went to an event, some of them later developed coronavirus. It doesn't have a control group of another equally large group of people who might also have a similar number of positives. And it also, like, the narrative, it's so fascinating, like group hysteria. The narrative is like, this is like DNA in a crime scene. You can trace exactly where you got this thing, but it's not true. So the studies that even show like children and teachers, and that's an infection vector, they really only show that some people in a large group were positive. And there is no, like, as scientists often tell me these days when I interview them, correlation is not causation. So I have not seen studies that show that well-ventilated, sanitized restaurants that are opening with 6-foot distances between tables are, spreading the virus compared with takeout, for instance, or compared with other controls. Like, that good science simply is not being done. So we really don't know. And what we do know is, according to the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons, when you open a window, you drop a viral load in a room by 50% in 1 minute. So, people are saying, from the world of aerosol studies and industrial hygiene, they're saying there are many safe ways to reopen these spaces. And then let's talk about, like, how many people are being thrown out of work, like who works in restaurants. But immigrants, immigrant communities.
A lot of undocumented people who, can't find other ways to get money because they're undocumented.
And also language is a barrier. So one of the places you can work when language is a barrier is in the food industry. And not only, I don't mean to be leading you, but, like, one restaurant going out of work isn't just the one sole proprietor you interview. It's like 25 staffers or 20 staffers, but it's not just them. They're sending money often back to their families, or they're feeding their families, or they're the sole breadwinner. So it's a ripple effect of hungry children and people who are desperate. And we're also seeing now the deaths of despair, as they call them, rising. So.
Right. I mean, I think part of the reason there hasn't been more protest about the closing of restaurants is that it's portrayed as, well, a bunch of upper middle class people want to go out to eat. Who cares about that? We have the coronavirus and people are dying. But as you just said, it's about much, much more than that. There so many people depend on restaurants for their living, and it's sort of very myopic to think of it in just that one way. And also, people do need things to do. I mean, we do need to socialize and be with other people in order to be happy. And if your goal is to prevent the spread of coronavirus, then doing it in a as you said, well ventilated, spaced out restaurant, rather than people's apartments that aren't going to have those kind of safeguards, then
that's a good point.
Makes no sense.
That's a good point. Let's go back to your takeaway. Were there any surprises from your interviews with the faces of lockdown?
Actually, I wouldn't say I was really surprised by anything. Everybody had been devastated and were just extremely upset and didn't understand why this was happening to them and why the public didn't seem to be more outraged.
Right. God, this is heartbreaking. Well, what should people do if they're watching this and they care about what you're discussing? Is there an action step they can take?
I think possibly calling your elected officials. I don't know how much that's going to do, but I do think this is depending a little bit on public acquiescence. And I think that once it's clear, once we start to say, no, we're not going to take this. You're not going to tell us we can't run our businesses. You're not going to tell us we can't see our family. You can't tell us we can't send our kids to school and earn a living. I think at some point things will have to shift. And that's presumably why in a lot of states things are open. And those states, by the way, things are going fine. Florida's been open for a long time, and they have fewer cases now than California.
Isn't that interesting? I'm from the same subculture you're from, and all my friends think that Florida is a bloodbath. No, I'm not kidding. And I'm like, I've seen the numbers. The states that open are doing exactly the same as the states that close. Like, the evidence is in, but our tribe won't believe it. So you're doing such a public service and bringing this forward. I'll share with you before we wrap up what I've been doing since I've really delved into this, and my eyes were really opened by your wonderful, wonderful piece and your colleagues' wonderful piece. But I've been eating in restaurants. Like, before I was like, oh no, I will go to my doom if I step foot in a restaurant. Now I've read the aerosol studies, and I also know how desperately these businesses need every single diner to survive. So, I go sit in restaurants, and I, not breathing in the faces of people whose status I don't know, and we're 6 feet apart from strangers, but I feel really good about using my, little consumer dollar to do what I can to keep small businesses alive. And what else would you recommend people do in addition to raising this issue and contacting their representatives? I mean, would these people say, tell your audience to come eat in our restaurant?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Go to restaurants if you can. I mean, if they're closed, I don't know what you can do, but if they care. And I think trying to, talk to family and friends, trying to bring awareness to the other side of this is really important.
Absolutely. I mean, the message is we're saving grandma and grandpa. The science doesn't really support that. Locking down a whole society does save grandma and grandpa as opposed to other measures, but leaving that aside, what isn't being messaged is this lockdown is crushing the lives of low-income people, immigrants, single moms, children, and that is a message well worth bringing out there, and you've backed it up beautifully with your research. So thank you so much, Jenin Younes. The piece is Faces of Lockdown. It's on AIER's wonderful website. You should subscribe, become a member, do all the things AIER offers for you to do. And it's also going to be on Daily Clout. And this is Naomi Wolf, Jenin Younes. Thank you so much, and join us again.
Thank you.